Hector had driven the Greek commanders from the battlefield. Agamemnon was wounded. Diomedes had been carried away. Odysseus had escaped a Trojan encirclement only after Ajax and Menelaus reached him. Now the Greek army was retreating toward its ships. But one obstacle still stood between Hector and the fleet. A deep trench, rows of sharpened stakes, a wall raised around the Greek camp, and behind it an army with nowhere left to retreat. The Trojans still had momentum. The Greeks still had time. If the wall held, the defenders could recover. If Hector broke it, the road to the ships would open. But when the Trojan chariots reached the trench, the entire attack stopped. The horses refused to cross. The formation crowded behind them, and Hector faced a problem that strength alone could not solve. Could he transform a pursuit across open ground into an assault against a fortified position before the Greeks regained control? This episode comes from Book 12 of Homer's Iliad. It is epic poetry, not a verified Bronze Age battlefield report. Gods influence events, warriors perform extraordinary feats, and signs in the sky shape military decisions. But beneath the mythology is a clear tactical situation. The Greeks had constructed a wall and trench around their ships and captured supplies. The fortification did not need to defeat the Trojan army by itself. It only needed to delay the attackers. The trench would break their speed. The stakes would disrupt their horses. The wall would give the defenders height and protection. For the Greeks, the ships were more than transportation. They were the army's connection to the sea, its route home, and its final line of survival. Hector had driven the enemy across the plain. Now he had reached the obstacle designed specifically to stop him. Hector moved through the Trojan ranks, urging his soldiers forward, but the horses reached the edge of the trench and recoiled. The sides were steep, sharpened stakes filled the ground. The space beyond was narrow, with the Greek wall rising immediately behind it. A chariot depended upon movement. On open ground, it could carry a warrior quickly into battle and remove him before infantry closed around him. At the trench, those advantages disappeared. The horses could not cross safely. The wheels could become trapped. If one chariot stopped, those behind it would crowd together beneath the weapons of the defenders. Before the Trojans even touched the wall, the Greek fortification had already achieved its first objective. It had taken speed away from Hector. Polydamas recognized the danger. He advised Hector and the other commanders to leave their chariots at the trench, give the horses to their drivers, and continue the attack on foot. But he also warned them about something beyond the obstacle. If the Trojans crossed the trench in disorder and were later driven back from the ships, the same ditch could trap them during their retreat. Polydamas was thinking in both directions. How would the army advance, and how would it escape if the attack failed? Hector accepted the immediate advice. He jumped from his chariot. The other commanders followed. The army reorganized into 5 infantry groups. Hector and Polydamas commanded the largest force. Other formations followed Paris, Helenus and Deiphobus, Aeneas and Sarpedon with the allied Lycians. The nature of the battle changed. The pursuit was over. The assault had begun. Not every Trojan followed the new plan. Asius kept his horses and drove toward a gate the Greeks had left open so retreating soldiers could enter the camp. At first, his decision appeared logical. Why climb a wall when an open entrance already existed? But the gate was not undefended. 2 Greek warriors, Polypoetes and Leontius, waited at the approach. Asius and his followers rushed toward them, expecting the defenders to collapse. Instead, the Greeks held their ground. Stones and weapons fell from the wall while the 2 warriors fought in front of the opening. The narrow approach that Asius hoped to exploit prevented his force from using its numbers. His men were pushed toward a single point where the defenders were ready to meet them. Asius saw an opening and assumed it was weakness. But a gap in a defensive line can also become a channel, one that concentrates attackers into a place prepared for killing. His attack stalled. The first attempt to bypass the wall had failed. Then an eagle appeared above the Trojan army. It carried a living serpent in its talons. The serpent twisted backward and struck the bird near the neck. The eagle released it, and the snake fell among the soldiers while the bird flew away. In the world of the Iliad, this was not an ordinary event. Polydamas interpreted it as a warning. The Trojans might seize the wall as the eagle had seized the serpent, but like the bird, they might fail to carry their prize home. They could break into the Greek camp and still lose many men when the defenders rallied near the ships. Polydamas advised Hector to stop the attack. Hector refused. He rejected the idea that the army should abandon its opportunity because of the flight of a bird. For Hector, the only sign that mattered was the duty to fight for Troy. The supernatural omen belongs to myth, but the disagreement between the commanders reveals a real strategic conflict. Polydamas saw what might happen after the breakthrough. Hector saw what would happen if they hesitated before it. Stopping would give the Greeks time to recover. Continuing might place the Trojans beyond a dangerous trench with no secure route back. Hector chose momentum. On that day, momentum carried him forward. The Trojans crossed on foot and attacked the fortification. They pulled at the supports, struck the battlements, and attempted to tear down the outer defenses. The Greeks formed behind their shields and hurled stones and spears at the men below. The two warriors named Ajax moved along the wall, calling on every Greek to remain in position. This was the advantage the fortification had been built to provide. The defenders no longer needed to stop Hector on open ground. They could fight from above. They could use the wall as protection. They could focus their weapons on anyone approaching the base. The assault became a test of endurance. The Trojans had momentum and numbers pressing forward. The Greeks had height, cover, and a narrow line to defend. Stones fell in both directions. Shields struck against the battlements. The noise of weapons, shouting, and breaking timber spread along the entire wall. But the Greek defense did not collapse. The first major breakthrough did not come from Hector. It came from Sarpedon, ruler of Lycia, and one of Troy's most powerful allies. Before attacking, Sarpedon spoke to Glaucus about the responsibility of leadership. Why, he asked, did rulers receive the finest food, the fullest cups, the greatest estates, and the highest honor? Because when danger came, they were expected to stand at the front. Privilege carried an obligation. If leaders lived above other men in peace, they had to place themselves before those men in war. Sarpedon and Glaucus led the Lycians against the section of wall defended by Menestheus. The pressure became so great that Menestheus sent for Ajax, son of Telamon, and the archer Teucer. When they arrived, the battle tightened around the battlements. Ajax killed one of Sarpedon's companions with a heavy stone. Teucer shot Glaucus in the shoulder, forcing him to withdraw. But Sarpedon continued. He killed one of the defenders, seized the battlement with both hands, and tore part of it down. A section of the Greek wall gave way. For the first time, the fortification was physically breached. But a breach was not yet a victory. Sarpedon called on the Lycians to follow him. The Greeks crowded toward the opening. The battle compressed around a narrow strip of broken wall, with both sides fighting across shields, stones, and shattered timber. A breach appears to be an entrance, but until it is wide enough for soldiers to move through in numbers, it can become one of the most dangerous places for an attacking force. The men at the front cannot advance quickly, those behind cannot see what is happening, and the defenders know exactly where the next attack must come. Sarpedon had damaged the wall, but he could not force an entire army through it alone. Ajax drove against him. Teucer continued shooting. The Lycians could not enter the camp, while the Greeks could not push them completely away. The struggle remained balanced. Sarpedon had created a weakness. Hector still needed an opening large enough to restore the momentum of the entire Trojan army. He needed more than a crack in the wall. He needed a gate. Hector called on the Trojans to increase the pressure. Then he approached the gate. Near it lay a great stone, thick at one end and narrow at the other. Homer describes it as so heavy that 2 ordinary men could barely lift it onto a wagon. Hector raised it alone. The impossible weight belongs to the heroic world of epic poetry. But the military meaning of the moment is more important than the feat of strength. Hector was not attempting to destroy every section of the wall. He was attacking the point that controlled movement through it. A wall can remain standing and still become useless once its gate can no longer close. Hector planted his feet, brought his weight forward, and hurled the stone into the center of the double doors. The impact shattered the hinges. The bars failed. The doors burst inward. The stone crashed into the camp. For a brief moment, the entrance stood open. Then Hector passed through it, carrying 2 spears. Hector turned and called the army forward. Some Trojans climbed over the battlements. Others rushed through the shattered gate. The Greeks abandoned the outer defense and fell back toward the ships. The wall itself had not disappeared. Most of it remained standing, but its military purpose was gone. It could no longer delay the attackers. It could no longer control their direction. It could no longer prevent the Trojan army from entering the camp. This is why the destruction of one gate mattered more than damage across a wider section of wall. Sarpedon had shown that the structure could be broken. Hector created the opening through which the army could exploit that weakness. The victory did not belong to Hector alone. Polydamas recognized that the chariots had to be abandoned. The infantry crossed the trench. Sarpedon and the Lycians forced the Greeks to concentrate defenders at the first breach. Then Hector struck the point that allowed the main Trojan force to enter. The wall failed because the attackers adapted, applied pressure in multiple places, and finally opened a route wide enough for their momentum to return. Hector's decision produced the result he wanted. The Greeks lost their protected outer line. The Trojans entered the camp. The ships were now closer than at any earlier point in the war. But Polydamas's warning had not become meaningless simply because the gate was broken. The Trojans had crossed the trench on foot. They were moving through narrow openings. They were advancing farther from Troy and deeper into a defended camp. If the Greeks recovered, the same wall and trench could interfere with a Trojan retreat. Hector had solved the immediate problem. He had not solved what would happen if the enemy recovered near the fleet. This is the contradiction at the center of his command. His refusal to pause created Troy's greatest military opportunity. But the same refusal would eventually carry his army farther from safety than it could afford to go. On this day, however, the danger still belonged to the future. Ahead of Hector were the Greek ships. Behind him, the broken gates stood open. Hector had transformed a Greek advance into a Trojan counterattack. He had survived Diomedes' spear. He had watched the leading Greek commanders leave the field. He had crossed the trench, rejected the warning to stop, and broken the final barrier protecting the enemy camp. But the wall had never been the true objective. The fleet was. Beyond the shattered gate, Ajax was still alive. Greek soldiers were gathering among the ships, and the closer Hector came to victory, the more desperately the defenders would fight. Polydamas had found a way around the trench. Sarpedon had torn open the first breach. Hector had created the passage the entire army needed. The Greeks had built the wall to keep Troy outside. Now Hector stood inside it. The road to the fleet was open. And for the first time in the war, the Greek soldiers could look behind them toward the sea and understand that there might soon be nowhere left to run.